In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the sixth chapter of Tagore's My Reminiscences. This chapter is called Versification, and as the name suggests, as the title of the chapter suggests, this chapter tells us about how Tagore started writing poetry. We have seen in the previous chapters that he is already interested in poetry. If you remember the chapters where the reading sessions of Ramayana and Mahabharata are mentioned, um, it is also mentioned that Tagore liked listening or hearing the rhymes and the rhythms. I also gave you the example. Actually, I drew a kind of similarity between Wordsworth and Tagore, and I had specifically mentioned a few lines from Wordsworth's "The Solitary Reaper," right? And the music in my heart I bore long after it was heard no more. So I also told you that Tagore had a similar experience with verse, right? And in the specific context of rhyme and meter and rhythm, Tagore had already said that it seemed as if even after the words ended, the ring of the words stayed with him. Right? So his early interest in poetry is already visible in the earlier chapters, in the previous chapters, and in chapter 6, we see that Tagore actually starts writing poetry. So let's look at some of the excerpts from this chapter. All right, let's look at the first excerpt. I could not have been more than 8 years old at the time. Jyoti, a son of a niece of my father's, was considerably older than I. He had just gained an entrance into English literature and would recite Hamlet's soliloquy with great gusto. Why he should have taken it into his head to get a child, as I was, um, to write poetry, I cannot tell. One afternoon, he sent for me to his room and asked me to try and make up a verse, after which he explained to me the construction of the poyar meter of 14 syllables. Right? So this word P-A-Y-A-R, it's actually a Bengali word and it's pronounced poyar, and it's the name of a rhyme in in Bengali poetry. Right? It's a name of a literary device in Bengali poetry. It's called poyar chando. Right? So when you write this word in your answers, underline it because it's in a foreign language as compared to English, which is your base language while writing answers. And use this, as you have surely used this before. Whenever you use any word which is not in English, you should underline it while writing. And if you are typing it, then any word in a foreign language should be italicized, which I have mistakenly left out here. All right. So the example is this example or instance from Tagore's life shows that he was, as a child, he was encouraged to write poetry, and this encouragement came from someone who was considerably older than him, and someone who had just been introduced to English literature and was probably reading Hamlet at the time, and this family member whose name was Jyoti, and he was the son of a niece of Tagore's father's. Uh, he called Tagore to his room and told him that why don't you write a poem, right? And that's how Tagore started writing. And not only did he randomly tell him to write poetry, he also, that is Jyoti also, showed Tagore, explained to him the construction of this meter, right? The Poyar Chando, like I told you, of 14 syllables. And this is how he was first introduced to poetic technique, literary devices, so to speak. Next we have the second excerpt here. I had up to then only seen poems in printed books. No mistakes penned though, no sign to the eye of doubt or trouble or any human weakness. I could not have dared even to imagine that any effort of mine could produce such poetry. Okay, so when this incident happened at the age of 8, that is when Jyoti called him to his room and explained to him um, the construction of the Poyar meter, and also told him to write a poem, also tried to construct a verse. Tagore had before that never attempted to write poetry. Obviously, how many 8-year-olds do write poetry, right? Um, and um, and such was the case with Tagore as well. So he had, like he confesses, he had seen poems in printed books. However, he had not written any poems. In fact, he says that I probably did not even have an eye for human weakness or doubt or trouble, which could then be translated into poetry. And he said he could not even imagine before this moment that uh, he would someday produce poetry. The next two quotations are actually kind of experiential in the sense that Tagore feels pity for a thief who was caught one day in their house, and then he draws a relationship between the pity he felt for this thief and poetry. Let's look at what this feeling is, what this pity comprises of. So one day a thief had been caught in our house. Overpowered by curiosity, yet in fear and trembling, I ventured to the spot to take a peep at him. I found he was just an ordinary man, and when he was somewhat roughly handled by our doorkeeper, I felt a great pity. I had a similar experience with poetry. So, uh, when you read this, you have to keep in mind that this is a very important instance from the life of a poet, because he has compared poetry with the most unlikely thing possible. The pity he felt for a thief is what he says was a similar experience to him as with the case of poetry. So before he had seen a thief ever before, he had an idea of a thief which did not match that idea when he actually came across one, right? So which is why he was overpowered by curiosity, and yet he was in fear and trembling, because to his mind a thief would not be an ordinary person. But when he managed to get a peek at this thief, he found out that he was just an ordinary person who was being manhandled by the doorkeeper, and he felt a great pity. So let's see what is the similarity in experience with poetry, which he claims here. When, after stringing together a few words at my own sweet will, I found them turned into a poor verse, I felt I had no illusions left about the glories of poetizing. So when poor poetry is mishandled, remember, just like that thief was manhandled, that person, right, was manhandled. Because you see, the moment Tagore actually had a peep at the thief, he realized that the thief is a human being, a person who was being manhandled. So similarly, when poor poetry is mishandled, even now I feel as unhappy as I did about the thief. So you see the metaphor here. Uh, the thief was actually an ordinary human being, right, who must have been compelled by the circumstances of his life to commit that crime, right? Just as just as he felt pity when an ordinary human being is mishandled, he also feels pity, or he feels terrible when poetry is mishandled as well, right? So this is a very important metaphor here. Keep this in mind. It might be useful to you in your answers, and it surely will be useful to you in thinking about poetry, and definitely thinking about Tagore's poetic theory. Okay, the last few quotations are in reference to a very specific instance, right? An instance of Tagore reading out poetry to a certain person. And let's see who this person is and what this reading experience to him was like. The first excerpt is this: like a young deer with buds here, which buds here, um, like a young deer which butts here, there, and everywhere with its newly sprouting horns, I made myself a nuisance with my budding poetry. More so, my elder brother, whose pride in my performance impelled him to hunt about the house for an audience. So you see, his elder brother, Tagore was the seventh um, of all the brothers, if you remember. And here, if you see the footnote, you'll find that the elder brother referred to here is the sixth brother, right? So the brother who was born just before Tagore. So this brother was kind of his accomplice, right? His companion in their adventures in poetry. So Tagore used to write, and the elder brother was like an advertiser. And if you know anything about the Tagore brothers, you know that Rabindranath Tagore is not the only one who came out to be such a great human being, right? Because there are other brothers There are many of them who have contributed to literature, to painting, um, etc., etc., in so many genres. So, nevertheless, the point here is to focus on the two brothers and specifically so on Tagore. However, you must note that the elder brother was surely an accomplice because he was kind of the advertiser for his younger brother's poetry, and that way you have to accept that this brother must have had a significant amount of contribution because he was the one who used to find people and make them sit and listen to Tagore's poetry, his brother's poetry, because both of them are Tagore. So I recollect how, and I'm reading the second quote here. I recollect how, as the pair of us one day were coming out of the estate offices on the ground floor after a conquering expedition against the officers, we came across the editor of the national paper, Nabagopal Mittar, who had just stepped into the house. My brother tackled him without further ado. Look here, Nabagopal Babu, won't you listen to a poem which Robi has written? The reading forthwith followed, right? And then Tagore reads the poem. And let's see what happens next. Tagore says, I was writer, printer, and publisher, all in one. My brother, an advertiser, being my only colleague. I had composed some verses on the Lotus. Lotus is a publishing platform, which I recited to Navagopal Babu then and there, at the foot of the stairs, in a voice pitched as high as my enthusiasm. Well done, said he with a smile. But what is Direfa? I never read poetry to him again. I have obviously shortened, there are several more sentences in between, but I have, for the purposes of this class, I have removed some of them. You should definitely read the entire chapter though. All right, so let me, bring this experience all together here. So, the one day it seems that Tagore and his elder brother, who was his only colleague, they had gone to, they had gone for a conquering expedition against the officers, to whom they had surely read out poems, right? And that reading out poetry was their expedition. So while coming back, while returning to their rooms, their quarters, they came across this man, Navagopal Mittar, who happened to be the editor of this paper, which Rabindranath Tagore's father used to, own, shall we say, or publish is probably a better word. So manage is perhaps the more appropriate word. Nonetheless, Navagopal Mittar was the editor of this national paper, and he was just stepping into the Tagore household. And this is when Tagore's elder brother stops this man and says, Navagopal Babu, won't you listen to a poem that Robi has written? And as you already know, his brother was his primary advertiser, and he used to make everyone read or listen to his poems. So Tagore did read some of his words to him with a great deal of enthusiasm. He says that in a voice pitched as high as my enthusiasm. So you can guess that his enthusiasm, as his voice, was both very elated, right? But this man, he obviously says, "Well done," but then he also says, "What is a direfa?" Right? And direfa is once again a Bengali word, right? Uh, and it seems that Mr. Mittar here, Navagopal Mittar, was not familiar with this word and seems to have objected to young Tagore using that word in his poem. And Tagore was not very happy with that. So, if you read in between what happens between the last line that I have quoted following the ellipsis, I never read poetry to him again. The reason was, it seems that this man, despite being the editor of a newspaper, did not know this word, right? Which was quite disturbing for Tagore. Nonetheless, this chapter overall, it tells us about Tagore's first experiences as a poet. We have earlier seen his interest in poetry. We have seen that he loves rhythm and rhyme. He believes that even after the words end, he experiences the ring of those words to remain with him. So we had every indication that he loves poetry. We also had other indications that Tagore was an excellent observer. If you remember, Tagore is someone who was familiar with the bathing habits of all his neighbors, right? He was someone who used to stare at the roots of the banyan tree. He had great curiosity as to what lay in all the houses that he could see from the terrace. So you see, there was all the indication that this boy not only loved poetry, he was extremely curious, right? And All of these combined together, surely he would have grown on to be an excellent poet. And that is exactly what happens in the events narrated in this chapter. So this ends the lecture on chapter 6, which is called versification.